Now, yesterday you were also invited here to have the Heckscher lecture of this year, with a fascinating theme here related to law and the corporations and democracy. So could you elaborate a little bit on that and what you think that has for implications for today?
So there is out there in the world a set of theories about how corporations function in the modern world. And the basic idea is that the world is divided into two categories, which policymakers consider good and bad. And the good is associated with common law countries like Britain, the United States, and other former British colonies like Canada, Australia. And the idea is that in those places, corporate governance, corporation law has developed in a way that is that protects shareholder rights.
And protects shareholder rights.
Right, yes, and that's a good thing. Whereas in the rest of the world, it's the law allows for blockholders or major families or groups of shareholders to control companies. And basically the general stereotype is that is not a good thing. So in Sweden, for example, right, there's a sense that there's too much control of a few families over the economy. At least that's the view in this literature. So what I wanted to do is to look at the United States versus Britain and see whether, in fact, they were as similar as this literature suggests, whether there really was a common law pattern.
To divide the apple in two there, the two big common law countries, which are very tied together historically, of course, when it comes to the law tradition, and governance and everything.
So they both have common law.
That's like testing the theory again, by dividing along those lines.
So it turns out that, as far as the common law is concerned, they're similar, but corporation law is a matter of statute, not common law. It's not judge-made, it's legislative. It's made by Parliament, made by the state legislatures. And when you look at what the law actually was at the time it's created in both countries, Britain looks very different from the United States. And British statutes give incorporators a great deal of flexibility, which then incorporators use to do the same things that go on in the rest of the world, right? Ensure that the families or groups that control these companies maintain their control. And in the U.S., the statutes are much more prescriptive. It's much harder to maintain that kind of control. You have to go through more contortions and it's much more costly to maintain that kind of control. So Britain actually looks more like the rest of the world. And so the common law, rest of the world distinction breaks down.
So there's some other factors underlying.
Right. So the question, you're right. And so the question, I'm sorry, I forgot about the democracy part. So the question is why you get these differences. And the hypothesis that I articulated was that in the U.S., general and corporation laws, these laws that govern corporations, are passed after you get the expansion of the suffrage, the expansion of the ability to vote. And corporations are actually a mass political issue. People are organizing in opposition to corporate privileges in the years before general incorporation. And so those statutes are inflected by that anti-corporate mood in the country. And so there are all kinds of restrictions on corporations.
To restrain them.
Right, restrain them. And they are persistent over time, these restraints. They're gradually relaxed, but they're very persistent. And even today, there are major differences in this respect.
So in a sense, the Douglas North view of elite society and open access, there seems to be some sort of similarity here.
That's
right. You have an elite deciding in England, this is the way to do it. We're sure to do it, but in the U.S. you've already done it in a sense, right? Through other means, and then there's a sort of a dialogue.
That's right.
In the country with much more people, right? Much more inclusive dialogue.
Right.
And then you get some other outcomes. So it's not just the common law factor, right?
No, it's about democracy.
That's your story,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And you're suggesting that there is this negotiation of these laws.
Right.
It's much more driven by a
Right.
more open access
Right.
view.
That's right. Exactly.
That's fascinating
Yeah.
to see. And how that applied today, you think, about the corporations and the questions we're asking today
Right.
about their because there is a request everywhere in the world for more dynamism and for
That's
more
right.
innovation, and politicians everywhere talk about, we have to go for the small, medium size,
Right.
and then. But that's more. We don't hear any. What are the policy consequences of that? More than
Right.
simplifying rules and things like that.
Right.
But how does that this
So-
learning from these two cases impact
Right.
that kind of topics?
Right. So bring back the rest of the world into that discussion. It turns out that that there is something to the common law civil law distinction in that businesses in civil law countries, that is in the non-common law countries, can actually get many of the advantages of corporations in other ways. And so I actually believe we need to focus attention not on corporations, which are really, especially in most countries, just the very largest
Yes.
firms, and focus attention on the other types of firms, various kinds of private limited liability companies that are really where the small, medium-sized sector is located. And many of these firms, if you think about the German GmbHs,
Yes.
there are
The
incredibly,
French, SRL and others, yeah.
some of the most dynamic firms are in that part of the economy. And so I think really we don't want to worry about corporate governance as much as we want to worry about these other organizational forms and how to ensure that that firms that are in those sectors are able to grow and develop and exploit new technologies. And so that's about that is more about access to capital. Now, it may be that in some countries, the banking system is much too concentrated and much too connected just with the corporate sector, right?
For historical reasons.
For historical
and the ones you mentioned in the beginning of this talk, right?
Right.
That it was made for them and by them, right?
Right.
And then somehow policy didn't allow sort of this to flourish another wave.
Right. So the U.S. always looks different from the rest of the world in the number of banks. Even today, right, we have a few big banks, but we get a lot of entry into the banking sector. And if there's a part of the economy that's underserved, we usually get some entry into that that part of the economy.
So these, what you're suggesting is something like that, different kinds of associations, corporations for different phases or sizes of company.
Right.
So that's your main point.
Right.
That we have to think about this problem of innovation, small companies and so on, in how they're best organized to get access to capital, to governance on. It's not just the corporation story, big corporation story.
Right.
But it seemed to be a bet a little bit maybe that the policymakers made on economies of scale and the importance of economies of scale. I don't know if you looked at that problem, because that is, of course, since the post-World War II, I mean, we have to rebuild Europe and the world, right? So it's very important to get things out, mass production and so on. But now, what you're suggesting is these new companies that grow up, they have other needs, right? So it's this menu of organizational options, in a sense.
Right. So if you think about say sequential industrial revolutions, there's the first industrial revolution, which is textiles. The second is the second industrial revolution is steel and chemicals, petroleum, and electricity. These are industries that have large economies of scale, and the structures of many of Western economies were put in place in those technologies. But now we're in a third industrial revolution. It's not at all clear that scale is as important as it was.
Yes, and we're Industry 4.0. That's what we're talking about a lot in Germany and so on.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And so you need different institutions. And scale is not as important.